today, kicking off our second session with Connie. We're going to be covering governance and finance today, but I wanted to welcome you all and thank you for joining. The Land Trust Alliance and the Connecticut Land Conservation Council are really pleased to be able to offer this programming to you all, along with the, made possible in part by the generous support from the PCLB Foundation. So we're just really excited that you're here, and I know that Connie has a really great presentation planned. Just a couple housekeeping items. We will have some chances to come off of mute and ask questions. We'll have some interactive features built into today's presentation, but if you could mute yourselves and stay on mute unless you're talking, that would be really helpful. I think most folks have already renamed themselves. Some of you may have chosen to include your organization's name. Thank you so much for doing that. It really helps us, especially me, as I'm getting to know all of you. And then I just want to remind you all that we have the chat feature enabled today, so you can feel free to use that throughout and let us know if you have any questions. It looks like we don't have any issues with Zoom today, so thank you so much, Rebecca, for knock on wood, clearing that up. But if anyone does run into any challenges, feel free to either send us a message in the chat, or we can put our email address and phone number in the chat as well, so you can reach out to us that way. But with that, I will hand it over to Connie to get us started.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to you all for joining us again tonight. Just as by way of review, I'm Connie Manis. I am a consultant for the Land Trust Alliance, for CLCC and others, particularly in the areas of organizational capacity building and land trust accreditation. My professional roles include that of a practitioner as well. So I really know what the practical side of this looks like, not just what the consultants tell you to do. I've tried it with boots on the ground, which I think can be helpful in having a very realistic perspective. One thing that I always find is that it's hard to find time with the day-to-day issues that arise to attend to evaluation and introspection and planning. Yet, time invested in these activities, including a deliberate look at risk and risk management strategies, pays off really in terms of prevention of downside risk outcomes, as well as preparing for risk activities that might lead to positive outcomes. So I'm really grateful that you've chosen to spend your time here with us tonight, and appreciate your commitment to your organization's success. The first few slides are just a bit of a review, just to remind us of this new vocabulary and ways of thinking about risk. If I can advance this, great. So we define risk as the threat or opportunity, the possibility that a future event or action might be different from what the leaders of an organization expect, and might adversely or beneficially affect an organization's ability to achieve its mission and objectives. So risk really pervades our work. Both bad and good risk. Basically, risk is any situation where the outcome is not a certainty. Any of those situations involve some level of risk, and risk management is a discipline for addressing uncertainty. So we learned last week that it's helpful to frame out risk using 3 different dimensions. The first is likelihood. A given outcome could be not at all likely, very likely, or fall somewhere in between. That outcome could happen very rarely or frequently, or again, somewhere in between. So the likelihood of a visitor tripping on the trail, for example, is high, right? Unless you have trails without rocks or roots, but those aren't the trails that I'm used to. It's not only likely to happen, but it's likely to happen more than once or twice. Magnitude is our second dimension. This is the dimension that says the impact of the outcome could range from little to large. If a person is going to trip on your trail, are they going to fall off a cliff, or are they going to fall to the forgiving floor of a mossy glade, right? And then the third dimension is directional, that the outcome is good or the outcome is bad. And we're talking here about a downside risk. Our example is the risk of personal injury, but the dimensions of likelihood and magnitude can apply just as easily to positive outcomes like new donors. All right, you might remember last week's rubric, which helps us categorize risk based on the dimensions. So let's just take a second to review how category A risks have a high likelihood of happening and a high level of impact. These are risks to focus on and to do something about. In other words, it's worthwhile to exercise some control to either make these things happen or not happen. Category B risks have a high impact, but are unlikely. For these, it might not be worthwhile expending a lot of resources, but it might make sense to think about what you would do in the event that this thing happened, or in the event that it became more likely. So that's what the word monitor is all about there. This also might be a good place, because of the high impact, to see if you can transfer risk by purchasing insurance, for example, or offloading your responsibility for that risk to a partnering organization that is more professionally equipped to deal with it. Category C risks have a low impact but a high likelihood, and it will make sense to manage these if possible to avoid the risk or at least the negative consequences, such as the case for our example of the visitor who might trip on our trail. We're going to look for obstacles like rocks that are going to cause the most trips, like roots that are going to be more likely to trip people up. And we're going to do something proactive to either warn people about it or remove those rocks or divert the trail or whatever it is that's going to, within our control, easily, mitigate that risk. And then finally, category D risks have a low impact and a low likelihood. And I think of these as being in the category of revisit. Think about dumping on one of your properties, for example. You might put a trail cam up or a trash can or signs, or you might just decide to accept these risks. But if things change and the impact increases, they might move into other categories. Okay, so moving into the topics of today, which are governance and finance. I just wanted to start off by talking about the board's legal responsibility for the organization's ongoing function and long-term sustainability. Those two things really lie with the board and are a fiduciary duty of the board. It's the board's primary job to protect the organization's assets, ensure that it sticks to its mission, protects its reputation, and plans for its sustainability. There are these three duties that you may have heard about: the duty of care, which is the duty of board members to know what's happening and to participate in decision-making; the duty of loyalty, which is the duty to approach the work with the best interests of the organization in mind, unclouded by personal interests or outside influences; and third, the duty of obedience, which is the duty of board members to work towards the mission and vision and really avoid mission creep, which is why we come back to our strategic plans so frequently to make sure that we are on track. And to incent or encourage encourage volunteers who are not receiving any financial benefit from serving on the board. Nonprofit directors are indemnified from liability so long as these duties are discharged in good faith and with the care that an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances, right? So there are three ways customarily that the board would be protected from liability for the organization's actions. These are charitable immunity statutes. So part of Connecticut's non-stock corporations law offers indemnity to nonprofit directors. There's also frequently indemnification statutes within the bylaws, and directors and officers insurance is a third way that organizations provide to protect their board members and thank them for their service. And make sure that there's no bad outcomes for their volunteer service. It's a common misunderstanding, really, that these protect the land trust as well, but they don't. They really only protect the board members volunteering to run it. And so I wanted to start with that slide just to, provide you with your own reassurance that that you won't be standing there with your pockets empty. But we still have to talk about risk management in terms of what the organization can do to protect itself. All right, so there are various types of governance risk, and we're going to talk first about risk connected with corporations, laws, and regulations. We're going to go through these a little quickly because there are countless risks. We're dealing with them all the time. I mean, there's almost, any situation where you can't predict the outcome is a risk, right? So, it's almost impossible to go through the full litany of risks or to even put them as neatly into the buckets as we might like to do. So we're going to go through some common ones which are going to resonate with you. Think about the different strategies that organizations use to mitigate risks. And we're going to leave lots of time for questions for the things that I might not be covering that you're experiencing in your organizations or want to talk through a little further. So the first slide here is about corporate risks associated with governance risks associated with corporate compliance. And in order to gain and maintain nonprofit tax-exempt status, 501c3 organizations must make required filings like the IRS Form 990, make some documents available for public inspection. You probably know all of this already, but just by way of review, they must refrain from prohibited activities like political campaigns, like lobbying outside of acceptable limits. They have to avoid or manage conflicts of interest, and they usually, have to have a written policy, make certain disclosures, do recusals, and all of those things that we do in connection with conflicts. They may not engage in transactions that provide private annulment to somebody sitting on the board or impermissible private benefit to an individual as opposed to a broad public benefit. And nonprofit organizations, in terms of compliance, must keep certain records and have a records policy. So I have a poll, and I'm going to ask Rebecca to pull up poll number 1 to see how many of your organizations are using any of the following strategies to help manage risks that are associated with these concerns. And you'll see that we're doing this all the time. I think that you can choose as many as apply. I can see that quite a few create like a yearly calendar so they don't miss those filing dates. More than 3/4 of us are having a conflict of interest policy where, members of the board sign an annual statement that discloses some of their potential conflicts. That kind of keeps us primed for thinking about conflicts as we go about our day-to-day business. Less likely to have a compliance officer or a governance committee that's kind of keeping track of changes. A record-keeping policy and procedures, almost 70%. A good portion of people on this call are participating in the Land Trust Accreditation Program, which will keep you consistent with your corporate compliance. And I can't see the chat box right now, but I think maybe I'm going to click into it. Okay, Lee, I see your comment to me. And, really, these are just some of the strategies. The other thing that's really interesting about risk management is that the same strategies aren't going to work for every single organization. It's not one size fits all. In fact, we're all going to fall in different places on that grid. And so this just kind of gives you a way to play with some of the techniques, but it's probably not true that each and every one of our organizations are going to do each and every one of these things. Okay, let's close the poll. Thank you very much for participating in that. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which are some risks that are associated with board composition. In the governance function, there are risks to the organization's sustainability if we don't engage new people in the work. Because if it works out the way we hope, right, that our land is protected in perpetuity, then we're only at the beginning of what will be countless generations of people involved in this. So attention to recruitment helps to protect against the oft-lamented, and here is why I included this slide, not just because it's Halloween, the dreaded aging board, right? But also think about the work that your organization might do with more capacity, different perspectives, and the help of people with diverse professional and personal skills, not just the people that are just like us. And depending on each organization's model, there needs to be enough capacity on the board to do the work of the organization, right? So for all volunteer land trusts, this often means that too small of a board burns people out. And even for larger, fully staffed organizations, the board's capacity to raise the funds needed to operate might argue for a larger pool of people to work on development. The bottom line is that there is significant risk to organizational effectiveness, and longevity if there's insufficient infusion of new energy. Members come off the board if they're not replaced, if there's insufficient representation of the community that is served, or if there's incapacity to do the work needed. And how board members come off the board is also an issue for management. I don't know why, sorry, I'm sorry. I got distracted because the poll was still up on my screen. How board members come off your board is also an issue. Last week, Christopher talked about board turnover and the risk that important records could be lost if organizational records are in the sole custody of certain individuals, as opposed to, belonging to the organization or in an office or a centralized place. So having a system for record keeping, which we'll discuss next time, more in connection with property records, is essential, as is knowing where the records are and building the transfer of records into your succession planning. And loss of institutional knowledge, while not as tangible as like a record that gets left in somebody's garage or basement, the institutional knowledge for people who are coming off of the board is also a huge concern in terms of succession planning. So it's the people on and the people off. And so now I'm going to ask Rebecca to pull up poll number 2. And this time I will share the results with you because I didn't know that was my responsibility. So can we have poll number 2? How many of your organizations are using the following risk management strategies that are related to board composition? And, I know it's difficult, but using and adhering to board term limits is one way to ensure that you have an infusion of new people. It's helpful to have a business process for recruiting and onboarding new board members. Too often it's just more like the warm body, or you meet somebody who you really love and you want them on the board. That's natural. But having a process to really analyze the board, which is the 4th option, and make targeted recruitment for people, with skills that you need, or with people who are of diverse backgrounds or perspectives that can help you better serve your community because of representation. Having some sort of an emergency plan is a good idea because you can't always control the timing of when board succession must happen. And I'm sure there are others.
And Connie, I just wanted to note, after about, 10, 15 more seconds, I will share the results of the poll, so you don't have to worry about that.
Thanks. That's helpful. Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca, for sharing the results there. It seems like there's, less of a majority of using each of these strategies, but a really good sprinkling among them. And we can talk more about those during the question sessions if there are any. The third kind of group of risks related to governance are those of shared leadership, right? So there's a risk to operations, really, if a board's dynamic impairs its ability to function, its ability to exercise the duty of care. You know, board members have to be informed, engaged, and utilized in accordance with their strengths. So when you have, you know, in contrast, discord or insufficient opportunities to robustly share ideas and perspectives, or maybe disorganized methods for getting the work done, all of these things can be very harmful to functioning and also to the reputation of your organization. So I have another poll to prompt you guys to see which strategies you're using. This is poll number 3. These are some different ways that organizations combat you know, some of the risks associated with, you know, a group of people, you know, who hopefully don't, you know, aren't clones of each other, who have to work together democratically, you know, to move towards the organization's mission. So the poll is, you know, whether or not your organizations are using some of these tactics, you know, such as having a regular board meeting, sending out the agenda and materials beforehand. And so the rule of thumb there is 7 days beforehand in terms of notice, and sending out materials at least 3 days in advance so that people have enough opportunity to review those materials. If your board, hopefully your board projects an atmosphere of welcoming, you know, curiosity, welcoming some questioning, really a safe space for deliberation, as opposed to, you know, a closed space where, you know, it can be difficult to voice questions. A place where board members feel comfortable sharing opposing views, and really that there's an expectation that not everyone agrees all of the time. I think that's hard, really, because I think that people who come to this work, they do agree most of the time, but like try to find those places actually where there is, you know, some, you know, opposition, where there is some place where you can engage in conversation and really bring the work a little bit deeper. Hopefully the board has processes for sharing responsibilities. So there's a way of spreading out the work and also giving, you know, some responsibility to members of the board so that they feel useful and their talents can be fully used. Again, having a meeting where, you know, unlike here, there's many people speaking as opposed to one. I think it can be very helpful to assign speaking parts on an agenda to make sure that, you know, you've got different people for every item if possible. So these are just some strategies. Strategic planning, obviously. I think that we can probably close the poll and share it out at this time if you haven't already done that, Rebecca. I think you have.
Yep, we're all set, Connie.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Okay, so moving on. And I wanted to address reputational risks because I know that Chris brought it up last time. And there are risks not only to your tax-exempt charity status, but also to your public reputation. If you don't carry out your work with diligence and loyalty to providing a broad public benefit that's free of undue influence among our leadership and our insiders. And so because of this, we have board policies, we have strict adherence to prohibitions on private enormment and impermissible private benefit, removing the opportunity for undue influence due to conflicts of interest, even removing the appearance that undue influence could creep into decision-making is critically important. So formality, objectivity, and process are your friends here. You know, you often hear people talk about the smell test, or whether it quacks like a duck, or actually our favorite from Linda Francois, the grandma test, right? Transparency and steadfast commitment to a public mission and responsiveness and accountability to our constituents is going to be the way that we are protecting our reputation. So you really can't go overboard in hammering home those tenets of the way that you're going to operate. You need to have a constituency, stakeholders who trust you in this work. So some of the risk management strategies connected with reputational risks are that your delegates or your committees don't make decisions on their own. They report out to the full board for its collective action. So this is a strategy against minority rule. This should be true for your executive committee as well. I know that it is a fairly standard practice to have an executive committee standing by to make decisions in between board meetings, but to the extent possible, avoid having the executive committee making all of the decisions and rubber stamping in the meeting. And do take the time to have the board actually vote to ratify any decisions made by the executive committee at its next regular meeting. Again, the board should be sufficiently informed and have the materials and the opportunity to discuss the matter before them, right? So in this case, I think Zoom has been a great innovation. Conference calls are okay, but what you really want to do as much as possible is replicate the fact that, people are sitting around a table together deliberating on something. And for this reason, I really caution against email voting. I know that in some cases it cannot be helped. When it is used, it's a record-keeping challenge, but more than that, it really makes it very difficult to robustly deliberate a decision. Board activities should be sufficiently recorded with minutes and meeting records, and then, of course, any conflicted transactions should be sufficiently documented within minutes that clearly show when somebody has recused, and also with other documentation. So if there's an insider transaction that's a financial transaction, for example, there should be benchmarking and other, other machinations that went into deciding that this was in the best interest of the organization should all be set forth in documentation. Okay, there's two more real quick ones before we break for questions. People talk a lot about governance risks that are related to employees and contract personnel, right? So there are the statutory obligations associated with having employees, like making payroll withholdings, like complying with employee protections, including those that prohibit sexual harassment, discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in hiring, laws that are related to compensation, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act, or state laws that govern minimum wage or pay rate, other pay rates, overtime, classifications in state and federal labor laws, laws that are related to worker safety, including Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, and workman's comp, right? So we all know that there are, there's quite a bit of regulation that we need to be up on if we're going to have employees, and in some cases, contractors, right? But injury to an employee or contractor can harm the organization with respect to its reputation as well as its finances. So I have another poll, once more, to see what kinds of tactics your organization is using to manage risk that is related to your contractors and your employees. And the first is that contractors, that you make sure that you've got that file papered with the fact that your contractor is adequately insured. In some cases, contractors will name your organization as an additional insured, giving you a little bit more protection. Employees and contractors should be hired using a set job description so that the scope of work or the responsibilities of work are clear. And you have an application and a contracting process that where you keep records, showing that you've determined that this person is capable of doing the job and understood what the job was. You might have written training and safety protocols. You might have, hard hats and gloves and safety glasses for people who are conducting work for you as an employee. You might require that contractors use personal safety equipment, protective equipment that would be associated with what you're hiring them to do. Some organizations make an incident report form to help them document something at the moment that it happens. You may have a set person who reviews laws and makes sure that you're in compliance with them. I'm just making sure, because I think this was the one where there were so many different ways that we address risk here that they didn't all fit, right? So we talked about performance evaluations, employment practices, insurance as one way of risk financing, making sure that the policies are clear and that everyone follows them, encouraging reporting of any conduct that's inappropriate. Some of the ones that fell off, we promptly investigate any allegations of wrongdoing in our workplace, including sexual harassment, discrimination, or unfair pay practices. So that's something that you should not only do, but have a policy that helps you adhere to the different steps that are needed to do that. And that policies might want to make clear who is the official spokesperson for the organization in times of crisis, and how that person will communicate with stakeholders about land trust business. So I believe that at one point Sharon Donosky did a whole series on responding to crisis. The last slide here is about governance risks associated with volunteers. And some of the risks around employees and contractors also apply to volunteers, of course, because they're doing similar types of work. But with volunteers, you might have, because of a lack of control or day-to-day, supervision and management, you might have a higher risk of injury to the volunteer or to others, that is caused by the volunteer. There might be a financial and a reputational risk if volunteers violate land trust policies and thereby diminish the standing of the organization in the eyes of its critical stakeholders. And there's a risk of losing support, right? So like on the flip side, you don't want to alienate your volunteers ever, right? So there's a risk of losing the support and the assistance when you have a lack of clarity about the volunteer's duties and responsibilities, leading to dissatisfaction or error on the part of the volunteer or the organization, or maybe both. And this is why for volunteers, just like your staff, it's necessary to have clear job descriptions and reporting paths. You might want to write them down. Appropriate training and supervision always, and support during the activity. Personal protective equipment, and different policies that govern the use of that equipment. I don't like chainsaws for volunteers. Other people use them, but personally, that is a risk that I find too high to bear. We talked about waiver forms a little bit, and waiver forms for volunteers can be one way of making sure that the volunteer, appreciates, the gravity of an activity that they're going to engage in and what some of the risks associated with that are. A waiver form alone is not going to protect you from all liability, but it can help. So there's no reason to not use it as an add-on to your other strategies like training, safety procedures, and good liability insurance. Okay, we're going to break a little bit for questions. I know that took us through a lot of the evening, but the finance one is a little bit shorter. So what questions may have come up on chat, or do we want to have people raise hand and then unmute? Either one.
Questions in the chat, Connie. So if folks want to come off of mute and ask any questions they have, go ahead.
One question.
Go ahead. Bella?
Would it help if I took the share down so we could all see each other for this period?
Be helpful, I think. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks. I thought someone had a question.
I did.
Go ahead,
Priscilla.
I
Nope, you're on mute.
get off again. Use of chainsaws. How key is it that the organization have a chainsaw training program that they require every volunteer that's going to use a chainsaw on the property go through?
If you were going to have volunteers use chainsaws, then having them go through a training program might be, might be the best way to alleviate some of that risk, or might at least make you feel better about that volunteer's ability to use a chainsaw. It's the impact, like that, if we go to the grid, right? It's, to me, that's a very, very high impact in terms of, the potential financial liability of the organization, but also reputational. I mean, that would be the worst, and moral, personal. That would be the worst, to have somebody get hurt because of a chainsaw accident. And that's just why, I tend to be very risk averse with respect to that one issue. But I do think that, for certain people, I mean, obviously there are many people that do know how to use a chainsaw. And so, to have certain people who are fully trained use them might be something that helps your organization feel better about it. Or you could hire a contractor to use the chainsaw and make sure that the contractor has the appropriate liability insurance. That would be a way of financing that risk.
I can understand financing the risk, but if we have multiple trails with multiple trees down and multiple people having to use chainsaws, it's not going to be a contractor, it's going to be a volunteer in almost all cases, not all, but almost all. The local high school is a tech high school and runs a chainsaw program, and they are willing to come out and do a program for our volunteers. I assume that would be at least useful.
I think it would be at least useful. And really, every organization is going to make their own decision.
Okay.
Maybe there's a group that has its own insurance that you could hire, to come, or that would maybe even volunteer their services. But the responsibility for the training and the compliance and the supervision could all be offloaded or shared with a partner even. I worry that, we as land trust organizations might not have the capacity to provide the appropriate training and supervision. I know that I myself would not, but again, I wouldn't fall on my sword as this being like the hugest issue. I think that, different people could certainly differ on this, and that really that's what risk management is all about, looking at where the risk falls on that grid, but also with the backdrop of where your organization lands on this. And so it's going to be your team together that kind of comes up with, where do we fall on the spectrum of our risk tolerance? Are we risk averse, or are we willing to take some risks for both, risks that are both downside risks and positive risks? Or is it worth us taking this risk in order to be able to get all that trail work done? Might be. So.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about term limits.
Go ahead.
So my question about term limits is, what are the typical term limits that land trusts choose to have? And could you answer the question for both officers and for trustees?
So in my experience, it varies, but I would say that most popular is a term that is 3 years for a general director. And that many times bylaws are structured so that there is a term of 3 years, followed by the optional renewal of another 3-year term. And then at that point, people term off, usually for a year. And then officers, that one is more all over the map. But the way that I've seen it is that officers get elected every single year. And I've seen a couple of situations where an organization deliberately limits the number of times that an officer can be reelected. But a year is a pretty short time to learn your job if you're going to be an excellent chairperson or treasurer or secretary or even VP. And so, the way that I've seen it working, usually there's not like a limit of 1 year and then no more. It's really nice to have a system where as an officer that you're going to be out after a certain period of time, enabling the board to move up, like vice presidents or others who are learning the job of the leader, and then moving and grooming them to move into that position. So that ends up being a succession technique. But I haven't seen that as firmly written in bylaws as I've seen term limits for directors. Christopher.
Thank you.
Christian, sorry.
I got a follow-up question, but also after my follow-up question, I will ask if you can kindly repeat the duties of a board that you mentioned at the very beginning. I found it very informative, but it was a lot of words, like a legal document. And if you can repeat those at the end, that will be great. But my question, following up on the prior one from Stephen, is about specifically the chair or the president of the land trust, and also some of the procedures around it. So I get what you said about the 3-year term and then looking at officers, once every single year. But what is really the best practice around, say, the election of the chair or the president itself? Because you could imagine a situation where you have a very successful president, a very charismatic person, for example, or someone who's very good at land acquisition or whatever, or has a good standing in the community. And they could stand there maybe in that role for 5 years or 10 years, and it may be totally fine. But what is really the recommended best practice around this process of choosing, voting for your president or chair? And should that also be renewed every year, or is it better if it's successful to also go for 3 years? What are some of the thoughts there? I'd be very curious on that point.
Right. So, this really, there is not going to be a one size fits all, but I would say that in figuring out what your organization wants to do, that, that very strong, charismatic leaders can be very effective. The longer they are very effective in their organization, the more difficult it becomes for others to imagine slipping into that role and being as effective. And I think that that can be a real risk, because many people are skilled leaders and they aren't all leaders in the same exact way. And so providing the opportunity within an organization for somebody else to captain the organization and to take the reins as a chair really opens the organization up to new experiences that it might not have had the opportunity to engage in, had they not made a switch. And so, I would caution against holding this one person up as, pivotal for the organization. If somebody's a great leader, they're a great leader. And so they deserve, all the credit that they get, but not to ever buy into the idea that no one else could do it. Someone else could do it, and they might do it differently, but they might do it every bit as effectively. And it does make sense to have turnover in those leadership positions. So I'm actually going to...
If you do have a charismatic leader, then the process of ousting them or changing it also becomes equally more difficult. If this is a very successful person in that role, then it becomes even more important to have solid voting procedures to make that change, because it becomes harder to change them out, I think.
Maybe that charismatic person might agree. And maybe that charismatic person would be just as instrumental in helping to bring in the new leadership. So we have to move into finance, or we're not going to get a chance to do it tonight. It is shorter than governance, you know, and I mean, there's so much to talk about with land trust that maybe we were foolish to try and do 2 buckets in one evening. But let's see how we move through finance and see where the questions are. And if there aren't a lot of finance related questions, we can come back to governance at the end. So, so remember that one of the board's foremost duties, and I will in the intro or maybe at the end of tonight get back to those duties of care, loyalty, and obedience for those of you to whom that's new. One of the board's foremost duties, though, is ensuring the organization's financial capacity and the sound management of its finances. And this means that it's essential that the board receives periodically and understands the status of the organization's finances. So it should be receiving reports that are detailed enough for the board to understand what's the status of the organization, how are we doing versus our budget, how are we doing versus, you know, previous years? Are we going to be able to end this year with a surplus? And that also the board participates, you know, fully in fundraising for the organization. So regular reporting is imperative. Let's take a look at some of the biggest risks connected with financial management. So organizational sustainability, of course, a board wants to make sure that it is making sufficient income to cover its annual operating budget and then some, right? So you don't want to find yourself scrounging for change underneath the couch cushions, right? Every year, you know, make a budget, know what you need, have a plan for raising what you need, so that you're never wondering, you know, whether or not you're going to be able to cover a needed expense. Related to that is the idea of perpetuity funding, stewardship reserves, and we know for land trusts that it is, you know, just essential that we have reserves put aside for stewardship defense in case one of our properties is challenged, and for the regular ongoing monitoring and administration that we must do in order to make sure that we're defending those properties, right? So, you know, it is critical to have reserves around to make sure that you can cover those needs. And for organizations that monitor using volunteers, you know, I often get the question, well, why do I need a reserve for monitoring and administration? Because I'm not paying anything for monitoring. So my recommendation would be, just in terms of contingency planning, think about what it would cost you if you had to pay those volunteers, right? Because those volunteers are not a certainty and they might not always be around. So if you really want to do the best planning for your organization, you have to think about, what would I need to pay if I didn't have the volunteer? How many hours are they spending out there? You know, what's their expertise? What level of expertise is needed to do this monitoring for my organization? And how do I quantify that and assign a dollar value so that I know that I've at least prepared for the future contingency of not having these volunteers around to do this work for me? Oh, you know what? Let me back up. I had a poll again in connection with, you know, with adequate annual operating funds and future stewardship funds. These are some of the strategies that we typically use. Again, annually adopting and following one's budget. Raising funds from diverse sources, right? Not just relying on that, you know, that foundation's gift, that, you know, high price foundation's gift that you've got for 5 years running, but that they've told you they're not going to renew, or that they're going to be tapering off. Tracking historic expenditures so that you can plan for your future needs, and setting aside reserves for specific uses and contingencies, like that stewardship enforcement funding, like that stewardship monitoring funding. But some of us also have reserve funds for acquisitions. We might call it strike funding, or other things that are related to the future potential needs of our business. securing financial commitments before taking on high cost activities. So not taking a property necessarily that you know that you're going to have to do a brownfields cleanup on until you know that you have the money in the pot. Recruiting people that are skilled in fundraising to your board, recruiting people that have a broad network and a diverse network that could be potential donors. Involving additional people in fundraising. They may not be on the board, but they can help you with events or they can help you with outreach. Recruiting people with financial expertise to the board, and providing support to a very competent treasurer and hopefully to a finance committee of your board as well. I know so many treasurers who feel kind of alone in the work because everyone else wants to get out on the trails and use a chainsaw, but the treasurer is such an important function and very, sometimes unrecognized in an organization. It's very important that the treasurer have a dialogue with the board and, be supported by the board in terms of the work that they're doing. All right, great. Thank you for voting and considering those strategies. Moving on to a third area of risk, and that is one related to your investments. Investments require prudent and continuous management, especially for our organizations where, the risk is great because you want the funding to be around forever. So having a finance committee, an investment policy, and in some cases, an investment manager for substantial investments helps to mitigate these risks. Some organizations move their investments to community foundations to pool both the risk and increase the potential for their investment to earn. And there might be other strategies that your organization is using to decrease the downside risk and increase the upside potential. So if you have different strategies to suggest, please post in the chat. And then finally, internal controls is one that we think a lot about, right? So unless we put in place systems and policies around the money in, money out, we leave ourselves vulnerable even when we have the most trustworthy people to theft, fraud, misuse, or mistakes in our accounting, right? So your procedures in order to mitigate these risks could include double eyes on all income and expenses, right? So nothing is dependent on only one person. There's no one single point of control here. So an example would be for invoices. The person who ordered the work receives and okays the invoice. Another person receives that and okays the payment. These are really just simple strategies that small organizations can do if we don't all have like an HR department that is 10 or more people. One person opens the mail, another logs in and deposits the check. The bank account is reconciled periodically against the accounting system, the books, by two independent people. So maybe one person receives the bank statement in the mail, another person does it, from the online, from the web. Cash collected at events is counted immediately by two people, usually from the board, who write the amount on an envelope and then seal it. It's an easy little one. The general ledger could be reviewed periodically by staff and the treasurer to make sure that accounting entries are correct. Nothing looks off. Financial reports should be reviewed by the treasurer, finance committee, and shared with the board periodically. And what that period is really going to depend on the nature of the business of the organization. So if there are a lot of transactions, it might be monthly. If there are very few transactions, it could be quarterly. Twice a year is maybe too infrequent, but might work for your organization. So those are some strategies, and I'm going to move us into questions. And I see that we're all the way at 6:55, which I apologize for, but do we have any questions that relate to finance for a couple of minutes? Julie.
Hi, Connie, thank you. So my land trust has been having a long, drawn-out conversation about our investment strategy, and I've been sort of a proponent of ESG funding and maybe even, divesting from fossil fuels. And I guess I'm not asking for investment advice, obviously, but I'm wondering if other land trusts are grappling with these things, and I'm finding my land trust is rather risk averse in this sense, although I don't know. I'm wondering if you have a pulse on things regarding that, or
I think it's a really good question, Julie, and I think this is why having all of us as peers together can be really helpful. So I would invite anyone here to to voice an opinion or to put in chat, some of the things that their land trusts have discussed around that kind of investing. I've been privy to a conversation or two, so I'd be surprised if there weren't others. Mike.
Yeah, so the issue with ESG funds is that they're not specifically targeted at environmental issues. They include things like, we don't invest in gambling or firearms companies. And then they have tons of companies in the portfolio that have major environmental impacts. They're just not direct fossil fuel extractors. So using ESG isn't actually that targeted, but we think it's still worth considering, and in the hopes that as those products are better defined and standardized and regulated in the future, we would probably move more and more money into them.
Yep, we've talked about all those points. Thank you. Yep.
And feel free to respond in chat if you've got another suggestion for Julie. I was checking the chat box. Sorry, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, I think that there are a number of questions in the chat. There might be, some other questions that folks want to ask live, and I would just take this opportunity to remind you to that you can share these questions with us, even if we're going to wrap up in a couple minutes here. But if you have these burning questions, please share them with us, and we can figure out a way to respond to those questions, even if it's in a future session or follow up by email. So I would just encourage everyone to do that in case we can't get to all of these questions, which I don't think we will be able to. But do we maybe have one more question?
It looked like Deb had put a question into the chat. I know I just saw a few hands pop up too. But Deb's question was, how many hands should the donations touch to have a secure process? And is there a rule or a guideline that you'd recommend?
So I feel like for some of our organizations, it's a challenge even to have two. And, I think that this is a place where you're going to need to balance, control. So
your audio just cut out, Connie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Definitely two. If your organization is just flowing with all kinds of people here and there in the office every single day, then, you might be able to build in an additional layer of control. It's always good to have people double checking, but at some point there is a limited ROI there because, often you're slowing down the process, right? I mean, if something has to travel through several different people across several different desks, you're slowing it down, and, your ability to catch new errors is going to diminish each time. So I would say consider doing more, but really definitely do two. How about that? Okay, I think that we're running up against time. I really appreciate your participation and your great questions. I have, really no more slides with content on governance and finance, but I did want to remind you that next week will be looking at risk management with respect to land transactions. And so I would encourage you to make sure that at least one person from your organization is at that session if you are not the person who's usually responsible for land transactions. But of course, everyone is welcome to attend, as many from your organization as want to. But definitely, if there's one person who's responsible for land transactions, it would be good to have them on. And then the final slide is another call for questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to every single one of them, but we're keeping track of them. And so there'll be an opportunity for us to address those in subsequent sessions. Keep them coming.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you, Connie, for an excellent presentation again, and we'll see you all next week.